This is effectively Enoch Powell explained.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very interesting life, because I think some people, particularly Americans, or particularly anyone that isn't British and anyone who's fairly young, might just not know anything about Enoch Powell, John Enoch Powell. Well, because he died basically of old age in like the late 1990s. So you could be like a grown man now in your mid-20s or whatever, and just basically never have heard of him. So it is a really important person, a quite extraordinary man, really. First thing to say, the first headline, if this is a new name to you, you may, if you've ever heard of him at all, it might be that he's just being demonized by the left. The Guardian, Guardianistas, or not even just the Guardian, all sorts of mainstream organs and outlets will use his name as just a byword for racism and bigotry and small-mindedness, fascism even. Well, the reality is that none of that is true. In fact, he was a very, very, very remarkable person. Very, very remarkable person. One of those people that was ahead of their time. He was able to see into the future, essentially. He understood the world so well. He understood the human character and politics so well that he saw far into the future, almost perfectly, decades and decades into the future. And not only that, had the balls to say it. Okay, so just to give you a couple of ideas, a couple of data points of what a remarkable person he was. He became a professor at the age of 25, a full tenured professor in ancient Greek at 25. Almost unheard of. So academically speaking, in terms of sort of sheer intellect, in the top, 0.0000, how many noughts you want to add percentage of people, extraordinarily clever. An amazing linguist, had many, many, many languages to his name. So there's that. Just someone that becomes a professor at the age of 25. It means you're truly remarkable. Okay, another data point. During the war, because he fought during the war, well, he didn't actually see any combat, but he was heavily involved in the war, World War II, I'm talking about. He enlisted as a private in 1939, and by the end of the war in 1945, he was a brigadier general. Okay, so again, that just gives you the measure of the man. Now, quick thing to say about that. His war service, remarkable as it was, he wasn't sort of a combat infantry general. He was in intelligence. Nonetheless, it just speaks volumes, doesn't it? Because to go from a private enlisted man to sort of a general of infantry within 5 or 6 years, that is sort of unheard of. But nonetheless, so he joined just straight away as soon as war broke out in 1939 as a private, was almost immediately made a corporal. Then the officers realized, oh, this guy, like all through his life, everyone just was like, oh, this guy's remarkable. Oh, this guy's like one in like 100 million. So he was like picked out almost immediately to go to officer training, which he did. And there they realized, oh, this is a genius. Oh, wait, we've got a professor that's 25 years old who's enlisted. No. We're going to make you basically a captain in intelligence. And so he went to North Africa in the war against Rommel and was heavily involved in all sorts of intelligence work in North Africa during the North African campaign. And once eventually Monty won that, he decided he still wanted to keep being involved in the war. And of course, after North Africa, largely the war in Europe anyway, transfers to the mainland, right, to Italy and D-Day and onwards. But he decided he wanted to be involved in the war in the East. He wanted to go to India and fight with the British and the Indians against the Japanese in places like Burma. So that's what he did for like the last couple of years of the war, all the time getting promoted because he's so right about everything. Right? So unbelievably correct about everything. I think actually I'll make this point towards the end again to stress it, but I think that's one of the important things to bear in mind about Enoch Powell. The sort of person that's very, very good at intelligence analysis is the type of person that kind of doesn't give a shit what anyone else says. It's like, no, I've come to these conclusions and they're sound conclusions because X, Y, Z. I can give you a lecture for an hour and a half if you like about why I'm right, and nothing else matters. My analysis is correct, and that's that. And you know, you can demote me, you can fire me, you can send me home, you can put me up against the wall and shoot me, but I am right. The truth is the truth, and I'm going to say it, and that's that.
It's raw logic and critical thinking skills, basically.
Yeah. There's one example it springs to mind where there was some intention. I think it was in the India, like sort of Burma campaigns. It might have been in North Africa, but anyway, the consensus over one particular bit of intelligence was that there couldn't be some heavy armor in some particular region because it didn't show up on any of the photos. But he'd come to the conclusion that, for various reasons that I won't bother going into the minutiae of it, but there probably could be, or there almost certainly should be. And when he went back and looked at the photos, where they, like the aerial reconnaissance intelligence photos, where it would have shown up if that was in the area, the photo had cropped it off. The photo just ended, right? So everyone came to the conclusion, oh, there isn't any then. And he was like, no, you can't make that. You can't come to that conclusion. That's not a safe conclusion. And he argued that and argued it and argued it. And it turned out he was right. And that's just one tiny, tiny little example. Okay. So another thing to mention is that, of course, he's been demonized, and we'll get into why in a moment, for being a racist. Say it with me, everyone. A racist. Well,
back in that day, it was racialist.
A racist.
That was what they were saying, wasn't it? You're a racialist.
Like he noticed race.
And cultures, and
he noticed that some cultures are different, and you can't just interchange people, and it'll be exactly the same. But it's funny. He was actually really quite liberal in various ways, even though he's a Conservative MP. He loved India, for example. He said when he went to India in like 1943, he said he just sort of fairly immediately fell in love with it. Everything about it. The sights, the smells, the people. Don't know what about the smells, but those were his words. He just loved everything about it. Of course, we still had the empire at that point, the very last few years of empire. But nonetheless, he said if the empire still existed and there was a place for a man like him in India, he would have lived the rest of his life there and died there. That's how much he loved India. Gives you an example. I mean, just to quickly flesh out that point about how in some ways he was really quite liberal. I mean, he was against the death penalty. Right? He was very, very sort of liberal in terms of marriage laws, different types of marriage laws. On various things, he was, he wasn't this dyed-in-the-wall sort of like Victorian throwback, like a lot of people try and paint him to be.
He wasn't the British Hitler, which is what most people make him out to be, for goodness sake.
Yeah. So just to move on, I guess, after the war, he comes back, and he decides to get involved in politics with the Conservative Party, and he was an MP for best part of 40 years, 37 odd years. So he's one of those people that the vast majority of his life he was an MP, and he was very often at odds with the party. When he proposed to his wife, he said, as long as you're prepared for a life on the backbenches, I'll never be a senior politician, because whenever the Tory party has a policy I don't agree with, I'm going to say so, which means I'll be condemned to being a backbencher, probably. So he was just one of those types of politicians who completely had his own mind and would never, ever, ever flinch 1 millimeter from saying it.
But that's the kind of politicians that we lack. And I think it's actually really important to highlight that as a positive note against him, with his strength of conviction and moral fortitude, right? Like that's something which we don't have in this day and age, the backbone that a chap like Enoch had. Just don't see it anymore.
No, it's very, 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 very rare. I mean, someone like maybe Rupert Lowe, but yeah, extremely rare, isn't it? Extremely rare. Another quick thing to say about his sort of besmirched memory is that it's quite new. I mean, even back in the 90s, it wasn't necessarily the case. When he died, I think in 1998, the Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair, said something like, regardless of, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something like, regardless of what you think of the man's views, he was a great parliamentarian. He was one of the great statesmen of the 20th century, something like that. You know, Margaret Thatcher said he was one of the most forceful, one of the greatest politicians she ever knew.
Yeah.
Lots of people, most people, unless you're a full-blown commie, will have nothing but praise for the man. He was remarkable. There's more than once he had he would be interviewed by Bill Buckley, William F. Buckley, and Bill Buckley's famous for being an extremely strong interviewer, almost browbeating people, almost like bullying them in an interview. And the force of Powell's character is such that Bill Buckley is like a timid little kitten, like almost asking permission to rebut one of Enoch Powell's points, you know. So it's very, very, very strong, very, very strong character. And again, exactly what you need. You want men of strength like that to be leaders. And that's what you really need. And again, what we've got a dearth of these days. And just before we get onto the immigration issue, which is what he's most famous for, I would say it's almost a shame, really, that that's what he's most famous for. Sort of the headline, first thing you might ever learn about him is his thoughts and feelings about immigration policy and the backlash to it all. When in fact, he wrote about and formulated policy on a great number of things. The only time he was actually in cabinet, it was as a defense minister. So he talked all about defense policy. He talked all about economic policy. He had also, in fact, his ideas about economic policy were so strong, so like sort of correct and actually right, that in the 1980s, when he was finished with politics really by the 1980s, that Margaret Thatcher was in, her entire economic policy was basically Powellist ideas. And she freely admits it. She, in an interview like years later, they're like, "Did you get all your ideas from Enoch Powell?" And she's like, "Yeah." Like prevaricates for a bit and then just says, "Yeah, no, basically, yeah, did." A free market, the free market is better than trying to have price controls and wage controls. Doesn't seem that radical, does it? Like, let the market set prices, but hey, back in the 50s, 60s, and even 70s, early 70s, they tried price controls and wage controls. Pure commie nonsense that never, ever, ever, ever works. So yeah, Enoch Powell wrote loads of poetry. Right, he wrote loads of books. He wrote an important book all about the history of Parliament, or about the history of the House of Lords. Anyway, like a true academic level quality. Like he translated loads because he was an ancient Greek linguist. Like he translated Herodotus and Thucydides. This is a true genius level guy. Right. Okay, so let's get to the main thing. In 1968, when he'd already been in politics for years and years by this point, and had, as I mentioned, once been in a Tory government, not for too long, I think only about 3 years or so, something like that, as defence minister, but usually was sort of out of favour with his own party, usually condemned to the backbenches, but had a huge influence on policy. Okay, so 1968 comes round and he makes a speech in Birmingham. He was MP for Wolverhampton, which is near Birmingham, and he was born and grew up in Birmingham, so sort of a Brummie, really, although you wouldn't get it from his accent. He's quite well spoken. In 1968, he makes the famous Rivers of Blood speech. Okay, so what it was, the Conservatives were in opposition and there was a Labour government, and they'd brought up legislation which was sort of race equality legislation, is that we should all be mixed together, essentially. And he makes this so-called Rivers of Blood speech, and not all, some of it is recorded. You could probably look on YouTube and find part of it there, but the whole thing wasn't actually recorded. And anyway, in it he says that to import foreign people or aliens who are like antithetical, got antithetical. It's exactly what's playing out now, Nate. Exactly what's playing out now. It's so unbelievably prophetic. To import hundreds of thousands or even millions of foreign people who've got no intention of integrating, you might not even bother to learn English, who will bring all their values over that are essentially dangerous to us and our way of life and our fabric of society. That's mad. That's literally mad to do that. That it's like it's committing like a slow suicide or something. And he finished this, and there's all sorts of other points he made in it, but he finished it by saying a quote from the Aeneid, Virgil's Aeneid, where he says, "Like the Roman, I can see." I'm paraphrasing again. I can sort of see into the future and see the Tiber, the river that runs through Rome, sort of frothing with blood, rivers of blood. In other words, saying this is all going to end terribly. You know, so another way of saying this is all going to end in sectarian violence, racial, ethnic, tribal, sectarian violence is how this ends. He's saying that in 1968, when the numbers were compared to today, very, very small. At that point, there was something in the order, roughly speaking, depending on what numbers you look at, something like 1 million immigrants in the country. Now, again, depending on what numbers you look at, is maybe something like 20 million. Who knows? The numbers back then were still very small compared to today. And already he's calling it perfectly. Again, it makes me think of the intelligence analysis side of his past, where, you know, something like I've seen an aerial, like a grainy, far away single image of aerial reconnaissance, and it shows what looks like the outline of a particular type of transport boat, which may be capable of holding heavier Nazi tanks. Extrapolate out from that in North Africa we're going to be facing Tiger tanks now, or something, right? And just calling it perfectly. It's just like, yeah. From a tiny bit of data, you can essentially see into the future, right? That's the mark of genius. But I think actually lots of people can do that, are capable of that to some degree or other. Not many have got the balls to just come out and say it, even if it ruins their life, it ruins their career, because it did. Ted Heath, the next day, within hours, in other words, fired him from government.
Even though I think it is important to note as well, he, as a politician, was incredibly popular with the public, but it was his own party that didn't like him and responded negatively to it. It was his party that destroyed him. The public loved him. He was, I mean, Keir Starmer could only, you know, dream of having an approval rating that Enoch Powell had. Good Lord. His approval rating was just off the charts.
Yeah. Well, shortly after the Rivers of Blood speech, apparently there was some polling, and it was something like 3/4 of the British public agreed with him. 3/4. All right. So
no, it's just mental. Like it's truly mental. It's truly remarkable that conservatives have done this, and it's their textbook MO throughout the decades of just self-harm, radical self-harm, right? They have someone that 3/4 of the public agree with, and they're like, let's destroy him. Okay.
Classic.
Why would you do? Well, we know why. They've all been pursuing a very similar agenda. It's just it's insane. It's absolutely insane.
Well, I mean, you can find like interviews with Ted Heath when someone just, you know, asks him, so explain yourself. Why did you fire Enoch Powell? And he comes out with sort of a classic. Again, it could just have been today. It could have been this week. A politician would come out with what he says in response, which is, I think that the best thing to do is to not inflame any sort of tension. And he was inflaming tension. He was being incendiary, and that's not us. That's not what we're about. It's like, no, he's telling the truth. So you're not about telling the truth. Okay. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, as now, telling the truth, as now we have seen. I mean, you know, Enoch Powell was so incredibly correct about what he saw back then. The only thing he got wrong was the magnitude of the damage. That was it. And that's only because I don't think he thought that Conservatives and Labour would be so suicidal that they would import as many as they have done. Because it's so irrational that the rational mind can't comprehend it. Even as someone, you know, as intelligent as Enoch Powell, I don't think anyone could dream of such cultural suicide that's been, you know, sort of amassed here.
Again, he would say back in the late 60s and the early 70s, he would say, look, this is just the tip of the iceberg. They're going to breed massively. They're not going to integrate, and that will end in disaster. That will end in some sort of nightmare. And he's saying that, and you know, he's just saying it's so ahead of the times, before it had happened, totally before it had happened. Right. And, you know, sometimes he would talk about how he'd get letters from people in his constituency or from Birmingham. And they say, look, already my street, my little neighborhood is like, I'm one of the last white people, one of the last white families in a now Indian or Bangladeshi or West Indian enclave in the middle of Wolverhampton or Birmingham. And I am being victimized. I'm the victim of racism. They like smash my windows and put shit through my letterbox and stuff. And so he would sort of say that and sort of mention that that's true. And again, back then, it's exactly the same as now. If you just mention something like that, then you're the racist. If you notice at all, you're the problem. Not the actual violence, not the actual injustice, but the fact that you've noticed it and said so. Exactly so. I mean, after the Rivers of Blood speech, whenever he'd like try to talk at a university or something, they would do the same thing they do now, just do demonstrations and just like shout over him when he's trying to give a lecture, interrupt endlessly. And the thing is, the interesting thing is, with that Rivers of Blood speech in spring 1968, he had already been saying this stuff for years, basically. He'd said it a number of times over a number of years. But this particular one in 68, it happened to sort of grab the headlines. And a lot of the papers, or all the papers, in fact, ran with it, saying, you know, what a terrible thing this evil racist has said. And it was only then that Ted Heath sort of took action against him and you know, fired him and stuff, which is interesting because what that says is, and I've seen Enoch Powell in much later life talk about this, where he said, so it wasn't the fact that I'd said it or had been saying it. It was that this time, for whatever reason, it's the way the news works, the way the news cycles works, is that now there was a reaction to it in the mainstream media, that now it was something the Prime Minister has to react to. And Ted Heath, according to Enoch Powell, and anyone who actually looks at it, Ted Heath just lost his bottle, lost his nerve. Could have stood by him and said, no, he hasn't said anything wrong particularly. And if anything, we'll look at making it our policy and, you know, let's have the conversation. No. He just shit his pants and fired him and said, well, we'll have nothing to do with this. It was just an early globo homo, bloody multiculturalist, moral coward.
Just a spineless fool, not a leader, a spineless moron bowing to the pressures of mainstream media effectively, which is what we see now as well. It's disgraceful. to have someone like that lead, not a leader.
Yeah. And so Enoch Powell, being Enoch Powell, never sort of recanted, never sort of said, oh, you know, I did the whole, oh, I'm sorry thing. I didn't mean it. No, he stood by every word because it's the truth, because that was his analysis, which has now proven to be absolutely correct. And so he stuck by it. Even in like 1972, or is it 73, because of economic policies, he decided not to stand for the Conservative Party because he had been saying what he thought was the correct policy, and the party policy was the opposite thing. So even though it meant that it would like damage his political career even further, he just didn't stand for the Tories. You know, so on principle, absolutely on principle, is that how could I go before my constituents, ask them to vote for me, even though they, and hopefully the Tories will win the most seats and will become the government, knowing that I don't believe in any of their policies. So that's a man of principle. It truly is a man of principle, and they're rare, and one that's prepared to stand on it, stand by it. That's rare. And not only that, but he was sort of correct. He was actually correct. And so now, all these years later, even now, you'll get some fifth columnist in even in the Express or the Mail or the Times or the Independent, let alone the Guardian or Metro or something, or the Standard, and they'll mention Enoch Powell's racism. Enoch Powell is just a byword for sort of gammon racism or something. And the reality was that he was a genius man of conviction, way ahead of his time. And if anyone's interested about it more, there's plenty of documentaries and biographies about him just on YouTube. Look them up. Listen to the man. Give him the time of day. Listen to him in his own words. There's plenty of interviews back from the 60s and 70s and stuff, or even 80s. Or there's a documentary from the 1990s where he's very old. He's quite close to death. So there's plenty out there. Listen to him for yourself. That's what I would say. That's what I think wakes up a lot of normies, or even people that might be slightly left-leaning or slightly woke, or if they're just completely neutral, new to politics, or new to policy. Just listen to the man. Take on board what he's saying. Don't go in with any preconceptions, and I think you'll be surprised.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this, and I think it's something which I would do it in a heartbeat. I'm not one for statues, but I think someone as prophetic as Enoch Powell, someone who quite literally looked into the future, not literally looked into the future, but was able to analyze and extrapolate outwards what damage was going to happen to the country if you open the floodgates. Yeah, and tried to warn us, you know, and was demonized in the process. If and when we win, I would put a statue of Enoch Powell up, 100%, absolutely. We have enough statues of, you know, effective child predators like
Gandhi.
Gandhi. You got terrorist Mandela. Yeah, no, I think we should probably have some statues with some real purpose, you know.
And I think we've got a clip lined up, right? It's actually speaking to Bill Buckley, and this is from 1969. So bear that in mind, how long ago that is. And if we listen to 3.5, even 4 minutes worth of it, I think it's interesting because they get right to the nub of it right away.
Well, would you explain to me, under the circumstances, why it is that almost all of the opinion makers in England, and even the leader of your own party, were so horrified at your expressing what you are now, in effect, telling us is the codified principle in England, namely control over immigration, even such control as might be used to terminate immigration, and a recognition that alien cultures are more difficult to assimilate than congruent cultures.
Yes, I don't think that the anxiety arose over that. One must remember, incidentally, that the context of my speech just over a year ago was an act introduced by the Labour government against racial discrimination, an act which the Conservative Party officially was opposing. And indeed, I made that speech on the eve of a second reading, supporting the party's decision to oppose that bill. And one of the reasons why we opposed it on the ground that it would do more harm than good. Namely, that in the areas of large concentration of immigrants, the effect of it, the practical effect, would be that the local inhabitants would feel that they were the people who were being discriminated against. Now, that's a not unimportant background, because even if today all immigration whatsoever were ended, bang, from today, we would still be faced with a rate of expansion of the immigrant population and their children concentrated in certain areas, which there is a great anxiety not to admit. And one understands this. First of all, if you belong, as all politicians do in England, to parties who've allowed this to happen, there's a strong premium on not admitting the full weight of the consequences.
But doesn't one suppose that as this population increases, the processes of acculturation go forward, so that after the passage of a generation, you're simply dealing with Englishmen with a black skin rather than with Pakistani?
Well, actually not. In fact, as the numbers increase, the tendency is for separation to increase. Let me give you a fact which will illustrate that. In Birmingham, which is near my own constituency of Wolverhampton, in Birmingham, which is a city of over 1 million, the proportion of coloured births 2 years ago, that's the latest figures, was 20%, 1 in 5. And it had risen from 5% to 20% over the previous decade. Now, of those coloured births, 10 years ago, a quarter were mixed. At the last of
You're talking about racially mixed?
Racially mixed, yes. One parent white, one parent colored. Last year, rather the year before, only 1/8. So that as the numbers increased, the degree of intermarriage and assimilation was diminishing.
When I said acculturation, I didn't mean miscegenation. My point is, doesn't one suppose that the passage of a generation spent in Birmingham produces Englishmen?
Not if it is spent in areas which are totally occupied by people of one's own culture, language, and we must remember that we are now primarily talking of East Indians.
Well, do they go to schools that teach English?
Well, there are increasingly pressures for them to be taught in Punjabi or Hindustani. And even if they learn English at school, they return, and the girls return to Purdah after they leave school. The Pakistani girls in Bradford return to Purdah after leaving school. So that as the numbers almost explosively increase in this generation, you do in fact get a pulling apart. Whereas if there were 1 in 100 or 2 in 100, then this cultural assimilation, whether it...
Okay, so he's just calling it. He's just called it like perfectly in 1969 when these things are in their absolute infancy. These things are sort of, as far as we're concerned, the world we live in now, they're sort of barely happening. They're just beginning to happen. And he's sort of describing the world we live in now, right? Like over 50 years ago.
Mad.
A remarkable person, I think.
Yeah, truly remarkable, actually. Someone that's, I make a concerted effort on my Twitter ramblings to make reference to Enoch in a very positive way, because people too often are completely, full-blown NPC mode, just completely indoctrinated by the mainstream media narrative. They just hit Enoch and they go, oh, can't say that. No, go listen to some of his speeches, go listen to his interviews. very intelligent person. Again, it would be such a boon to politics to have someone as intelligent as that in Parliament in this day. There is no one as intelligent as Enoch Powell in Parliament today. No MP, none, literally none.